The summer of 1927 was the summer the Mississippi decided it had been patient long enough. The river had been rising since March, fed by snowmelt from the Dakotas and relentless rain across the Ohio Valley, and by the time the levees in southeast Missouri began to fail in late April, the water was moving with a deliberateness that people in the lowlands would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. It did not crash, it rose. It pressed through weak points in earthworks that engineers had spent decades building, and it spread across the bottomland with a slow, irresistible indifference that flattened crops, lifted houses off their foundations, and drove 250,000 people from their homes across 7 states. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 remains the most destructive river flood in the recorded history of the United States. It broke more than 145 levees. It covered 27,000 square miles of land in water. It killed an estimated 500 people, though the true count among the black tenant farmers of the Delta almost certainly ran much higher and was never formally reconciled. Historians have written entire shelves of books about what the flood destroyed and who it displaced. Almost none of them mention what the water uncovered when it eventually pulled back. In the hill country of central Missouri, well above the worst of the flood's reach, the disaster expressed itself differently. The heavy rains that fed the Mississippi also saturated the upland terrain, filled every creek and hollow to capacity, and in the case of one abandoned limestone quarry in Moniteau County, did something no one in the district had anticipated. The quarry had been worked in the 1880s and early 90s, one of a dozen operations that pulled building stone out of the Missouri hills during the construction boom that followed the railroad's arrival. By 1900, it was played out, its best seams exhausted, and the company that owned it had moved its equipment south and left the pit to fill with groundwater. For 27 years, the quarry had sat as a local swimming hole, a roughly rectangular depression in the limestone roughly 120 feet at its longest dimension, steep-sided, the water dark green and cold even in August. Children from the 2 nearest farms used it in summer. Their parents warned them about the drop-off at the far end where the floor disappeared into a worked passage that went somewhere no one had thought to map. When the rains of 1927 overwhelmed the hillside drainage above the quarry, the water table did not rise in the pit. It fell. The mechanism was counterintuitive but not complicated. The same deluge that flooded the valley below had opened a sinkhole in the limestone formation southeast of the pit, and the sinkhole connected, through a fracture system in the rock, directly to the quarry's lower chamber. The water that had pooled in the pit for decades drained out through that fracture in a matter of hours, and by the morning of the 12th of May 1927, the quarry floor was exposed for the first time since before living memory. What the mud showed when it dried was not what anyone expected to find at the bottom of an old limestone pit in the middle of Missouri. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The man who first walked the quarry floor after the water left was named Elias Croft. He was 53 years old, a farmer whose property bordered the eastern edge of the pit, and by the accounts of his son and his nephew, a careful and undemonstrative man who was not given to invention. He had grown up swimming in the quarry before it filled, knew its dimensions and the smell of its stone, and when he noticed the water was gone on the morning of the 12th, he climbed down the access track that the old quarry crews had cut into the eastern wall and walked the exposed floor. The mud was ankle-deep in places, and the smell was the particular smell of limestone that has been wet for a very long time, alkaline and faintly mineral, with something underneath it that Croft's nephew, in a letter written 40 years later to a local historian named Ruth Bauer, described as the smell of a closed room. What Croft found at the far end of the quarry floor, in the section that had always been deepest and most shadowed, was a series of cut marks in the exposed limestone that did not come from quarry tools. Drill marks of an 1880s operation have a specific character, round, consistent in diameter, arranged in patterns that follow the bedding planes of the stone. What Croft was looking at did not follow the bedding planes, The cuts ran across the grain of the rock in a series of parallel grooves, approximately 3 inches deep, and spaced at intervals, his nephew's letter estimated as between 8 and 11 inches. They ran for a distance of perhaps 30 feet along the base of the eastern wall before disappearing under a shelf of collapsed limestone. The grooves were not scratches, they had been worked deliberately into the rock face by something harder than limestone, and applied with a consistency of pressure that spoke of sustained effort, not casual marking. Croft walked the length of them twice before he crouched at the end nearest the collapsed shelf and looked at where they went. Beneath the shelf, where the floor dropped away into the worked passage the old-timers had warned children about, the grooves continued. They went down. He could not see how far. But the character of the cuts changed as they descended. The parallel grooves gave way to something else, a series of carved recesses in the wall of the passage, each one roughly the size and shape of a place to put a hand or a foot, spaced at intervals that made sense if you were climbing. Someone had cut handholds into the wall of that passage. Not a quarry crew descending to check a seam. Quarry crews used ladders and rope. Someone had cut holds that implied returning to this place repeatedly, descending into the dark under the Missouri limestone and coming back up again, over a period long enough to smooth the edges of the cuts with use. The age of the grooves and the handholds is the part of this account that cannot be resolved cleanly, and that difficulty is worth naming directly rather than talking around it. Limestone weathers. Cut stone in a dry environment shows its age in the rounding of edges, the accumulation of mineral deposits in crevices, the fading of tool marks under slow oxidation. The quarry floor had been underwater for 27 years, which both preserved the cuts from weathering and complicated any reading of their surface. What Croft observed, and what his nephew recorded from Croft's own descriptions, was that the grooves showed no sign of the tool striations that the quarry's own drill marks still displayed clearly. The quarry work from the 1880s was sharp-edged, precise, mechanical in its character. The cuts Croft was looking at were older in a way that Croft, who knew that quarry stone as well as any man living, could not account for by any recent process he recognized. He went back to his farm that afternoon, said nothing to his wife, and returned the next morning with a lamp and a length of rope. He descended the handholds into the passage. He did not tell anyone what he found when he came back up. He told his nephew, but only years later, and only once, and the nephew's letter to Ruth Bower is the only place that account was written down. To understand what Croft may have been looking at, you have to understand what the limestone country of central Missouri holds, and what it has been holding for far longer than the European record knows to account for. The Osage people had lived in this part of Missouri for generations before any French trapper set eyes on the Missouri River, and before the Osage, the archaeological record describes a continuous human presence in the Ozark Plateau region, going back more than 10,000 years. The limestone formations of central Missouri are riddled with natural caves, and those caves were not idle space to the people who lived above them. They were shelter, storage, ceremonial space, and in some cases, industrial sites. Archaeologists working in the Ozark region through the 20th century documented the use of limestone caves for the processing and storage of ochre, for the burial of the dead, for the keeping of materials that needed to stay dry and cold, and for purposes that the physical evidence implies without resolving. The Osage themselves maintained a detailed oral account of the land they occupied, including the limestone country. Their traditions described passages in the rock that went down into the earth far enough to reach water that ran underground, and chambers within those passages that held things placed there by the people who came before them. The Osage did not claim credit for what was in those chambers. They described it as older than their own memory of the land, which by the time the first European accounts were being written in the early 1800s was already a memory that reached back further than any living person could specify. When Henry Rowe Schoolcraft traveled through the Missouri Ozarks in 1818 and 1819, documenting the region's geography and its peoples, he recorded Osage accounts of stone-lined passages in the hills that the tribe regarded as belonging to an earlier people. Schoolcraft noted the accounts and moved on. The survey he was conducting was interested in the land's surface and its resources. What the Osage said was under the rock was filed as oral tradition and not followed up. The institutional framework that processed the American interior in the 19th century was not designed to accommodate a pre-Columbian timeline that complicated the story of empty land waiting for settlement. The Bureau of American Ethnology, established by Congress in 1879, gathered an enormous body of indigenous testimony about the continent's past, and it gathered it with genuine scholarly effort. But the framework within which that testimony was interpreted consistently placed indigenous oral accounts in the category of myth when they described physical structures, trade systems, or human timelines that the prevailing archaeological consensus had not confirmed. The Osage accounts of stone-lined underground passages in the Missouri limestone were not dismissed outright. They were absorbed into the general category of sacred landscape narrative and left there, which had the same functional effect as dismissal. No one with a lantern and a rope went looking. What the geological record of the Ozark Plateau does confirm, independent of any oral account or disputed field report, is that the limestone formations of central Missouri contain an extensive and incompletely mapped system of passages and chambers. The Missouri Department of Natural Resources has catalogued more than 6,000 caves in the state, making it one of the most cave-dense regions in North America. The majority of those caves have not been archaeologically surveyed. The majority of those surveys that have been conducted were oriented toward geological assessment, not toward the human use of cave interiors in the pre-Columbian period. What little archaeological work has been done in Missouri cave systems has returned results that consistently push the known timeline of human activity in the region further back than the preceding survey had established. The River Bluff Cave, discovered in 2001 during highway construction near Springfield, contained evidence of human presence that has been dated to as far back as 9,000 years before present. The cave had been sealed by a collapsed entrance and was entirely unknown to the archaeological community until a backhoe opened it. It is not a small or marginal site. It contains claw marks from short-faced bears, evidence of human-set fires, and worked bone material that documented a period of use extending across millennia. The existence of River Bluff Cave was not a matter of suppressed or overlooked evidence. It was simply unknown. The Missouri limestone is full of things that are simply unknown, and the rate at which unknown things surface from it is consistent enough that the gap between what has been found and what may remain to be found is genuinely difficult to estimate. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Elias Croft's nephew was named Vernon Hale. He was born in 1914, which means he was 13 years old in the summer the quarry drained and too young to have gone down into the passage himself. What he preserved in the letter to Ruth Bower was what his uncle had told him in the spring of 1961, when Croft was 87 years old and, by Hale's account, had decided that he had held the thing long enough. Bower was at that time a researcher at the State Historical Society of Missouri, and she had been collecting accounts of the 1927 flood's effects on the Moniteau County hill country for a regional history project that was eventually published in 1966 as a limited-run volume covering the flood's impact on central Missouri. Croft's account did not appear in that volume. Bower included a footnote referencing a personal communication regarding an unusual geological feature exposed by the flood's drainage effects, but the footnote gave no details and cited no source by name. The letter from Hale to Bower, in which he transcribed what his uncle had told him, is held in the Bower family papers, which were donated to the State Historical Society in 1989, 2 years after Bower's death. The letter is there. It has not been published. It has been cited once, in a 2014 master's thesis on flood documentation in the Missouri Hill Country, in a footnote that noted its existence without quoting its content. What Hale recorded from Croft's account was this. Croft descended the Handholds into the passage on the morning of the 13th of May, 1927, carrying a coal oil lamp and a length of rope tied at the surface. The passage narrowed below the quarry floor and then widened again after a descent of perhaps 20 feet, opening into a chamber that Croft estimated at roughly the size of a large room, perhaps 20 feet across and high enough to stand upright at the center. The floor of the chamber was not the natural limestone rubble he expected. It was flat, not smoothed by water, which leaves a particular polished quality, but flat in the way that worked stone is flat, dressed to a level surface and fitted at the joints with care. Croft's lamp was not strong enough to illuminate the full chamber from where he stood, but what he could see of the floor in his immediate vicinity showed stone that had been shaped by something other than natural process and laid with an intention he could not ascribe to the quarry crew who had worked above him 40 years earlier. The quarry operation had no known underground component. The worked passage connecting to the chamber appeared on no map of the original quarry. The company that had operated the pit had been dissolved, its records archived in a business register in Jefferson City that showed only the surface dimensions of the claim and the total tonnage extracted. Croft did not explore the chamber beyond what the lamp allowed him to see from the foot of the handhold passage. He described to his nephew two things that he saw clearly. The first was that along the far wall of the chamber, where the lamp's light reached at the edge of its throw, there were objects that he could not identify at that distance, but that did not read to him as natural stone. He described them as arranged. He described the arrangement as deliberate, the way tools are arranged on a shelf or jars on a cellar board, with a logic to their placement that implied someone had put them there and expected to return for them. The second was that the floor of the chamber, close to where he was standing, showed marks that he described as writing, or something like writing, cut into the stone surface in a pattern that had none of the randomness of natural fracture and all of the precision of something meant to be read. He could not read it. He spent perhaps 10 minutes in the chamber before the lamp began to dim, and he climbed back up. He did not go back down. He told his nephew that the quarry began to take water again within 48 hours, as the drainage system that had opened in the sinkhole to the southeast partially resealed, and by the end of the month, the pit had refilled to within a few feet of its former level. The floor was covered. The passage went under. Whatever Croft had seen in that chamber went back into the dark, and the quarry resumed its quiet existence as a green pool in the Missouri hills. The floor markings, the arranged objects, the handhold passage, all of it returned to the water and the stone and the particular silence of things the ground chooses to keep. The question of who may have worked that chamber and cut those marks into the Missouri limestone is one the evidence allows a range of answers to and forecloses none of them. The Osage presence in Moniteau County is documented going back through the French colonial period. Their knowledge of the limestone country's underground systems was extensive and practical. But the Osage accounts of underground stone chambers in the hill country, as Schoolcraft recorded them in 1818, specifically distinguished between what the Osage themselves had made and what they described as older, already present when their people came into that country. The distinction is not incidental. It appears consistently in the Osage accounts that Schoolcraft documented and in later ethnographic work by Francis La Flèche, the Osage scholar who spent decades in the early 20th century recording the detailed cosmological and territorial knowledge his people carried. La Flèche's work, published through the Bureau of American Ethnology between 1914 and 1931, preserves Osage descriptions of what the land held that are specific enough in their detail to constitute a form of geography. Passages in the rock that connected to underground water. Chambers that held the work of earlier hands. Marks on stone that La Flèche recorded his informants describing as belonging to people who knew the land before the Osage did. A formulation that in the Osage understanding implied considerable antiquity. La Flèche's published volumes on Osage cosmology and ceremonial knowledge are among the most detailed records of any North American indigenous intellectual tradition. They are also almost entirely unknown outside the narrow academic community that works on Osage history and culture, a community that has shrunk with the field and is not well funded. The Bureau of American Ethnology that employed La Flèche was dissolved in 1964, and its functions were absorbed into the Smithsonian Institution's Anthropology Department. The archive it left behind is extensive and largely undigitized. The specific volumes and field notes that bear on the Ozark limestone country are accessible to researchers who know to look for them. Most researchers do not know to look for them because the connection between La Flèche's published work on Osage cosmology and the physical archaeology of the Missouri cave systems has not been drawn by any institution with the budget to pursue it. This is not a deliberate concealment. It is something quieter and in some ways more durable than concealment. It is the structural consequence of disciplines that do not speak to each other, of archives that are underfunded and hard to search, of fieldwork that is oriented toward confirmation of the existing timeline rather than toward the anomalies that strain it. The result, regardless of mechanism, is that the Osage accounts of what the Missouri limestone contains have never been systematically compared to the physical archaeology of that limestone system. The comparison has not been made. The data for making it exists in archives in Washington and Jefferson City and in the published volumes of Francis La Flèche. It has simply not been assembled by anyone with the authority and the resources to act on what that assembly might show. The quarry in Moniteau County is not on any heritage register. The drainage event of 1927 is documented in the Missouri State Archives flood records as an anomalous hydrogeological event in the hill country north of Tipton, noted in a survey of flood-related drainage disruptions compiled in 1929. The survey gives coordinates general enough to locate the quarry within a square mile, but not precise enough to identify a specific property. The quarry's original land claim is traceable through the county assessor's records. The property passed through several hands in the 20th century and is currently held by a family who, as of the most recent public record, used the land for cattle grazing. The quarry pit is still there, it still holds water, it has not been archaeologically surveyed. The passage at its deep end, if it remained open after the drainage event, is now submerged again and has been for nearly a century. Vernon Hale lived until 1993. He gave no interviews about the letter he had written to Ruth Bauer. The 2014 thesis that cited the letter was written by a graduate student at the University of Missouri who had been researching flood documentation and came across the Bauer papers in the course of archival work on a different subject entirely. The thesis was accepted, filed, and has not been cited by any subsequent publication. The graduate student, whose name appears on the thesis, is now working in a different field. What the mud uncovered on the floor of that quarry in May of 1927 had not weathered. That is the detail that sits at the center of this account and will not move. Limestone that has been exposed to air and water for centuries shows it. Tool marks soften, edges round. The mineral surface acquires a patina that a trained eye reads the way tree rings are read, as a record of time and exposure. What Croft described, and what his nephew recorded from his description, was stone that had been cut and then sealed. Sealed by water and by the particular alkaline chemistry of a flooded limestone pit, which preserves stone surfaces in a way that open-air exposure does not. The floor of that chamber, if it exists and if it is what Croft described, had been kept from weathering by the very thing that hid it. The water was not only its concealment, the water was its preservation. This is the logic that the geology of the situation makes plain, without requiring any specific claim about who cut the stone or when. A worked surface sealed under cold, still, alkaline water does not weather the way a worked surface exposed to air does. If someone cut marks into the floor of a limestone chamber, and that chamber subsequently filled with water from the regional water table, those marks would emerge from the water in something close to the condition they went in. The quarry's drainage in 1927 was not just an exposure event, it was the return of something that the ground had been keeping in suspension, in the chemical and physical sense, for whatever period had elapsed between its making and its sealing. The period is the question the evidence cannot answer. The handholds in the passage wall, the cut grooves along the quarry's eastern face, the dressed floor, and the marks Croft described by lamplight 30 feet below the surface of a Missouri quarry, none of these have been dated, because none of them have been examined by anyone with the instruments and the mandate to date them. The window for doing so existed for 48 hours in May of 1927 and was observed by one man with a coal oil lamp who told one person what he saw 34 years after the fact, and died before anyone with institutional access could sit across a table from him and ask the questions that would have mattered. The quarry is still there, the land record is clear enough to locate it, the Moniteau County Assessor's Office holds the chain of title, the State Historical Society holds the Bauer Papers and within them the Hale Letter. The 2014 thesis, filed in the University of Missouri Library System, cites both. A hydrogeological survey of the site would establish whether the fracture system that drained the quarry in 1927 remains open or has fully resealed. If it remains partially open, the water level in the pit may still be below the chamber entrance at certain times of year, particularly in dry summers when the regional water table drops. That is a question an instrument in the ground could answer in a day. No one has put an instrument in the ground, no university has proposed a survey, no state agency has flagged the site for investigation. The Bauer Papers sit in the Historical Society's archive, catalogued and accessible to researchers who request them, read by almost no one. The quarry sits in a cattle pasture in Moniteau County and holds its green water through every season, warm in summer, cold in winter, and in the deepest part of it, the passage that the old swimmers were warned away from drops down through the rock to a chamber floor that one man saw by lamplight on a May morning nearly a century ago and carried in silence for 34 years before he let one other person hold the weight of it. What the flood gave back, the flood also took back. The water rose again within 2 days, and whatever the chamber held went under before anyone else could see it. But water does not destroy cut stone, it does not dissolve dressed limestone, or erase marks that were deep enough to survive the original making. What was there when Croft descended is, in all geological probability, still there, still sealed, still preserved by the same alkaline cold that hid it. The marks on the floor of that chamber have not weathered since the morning Elias Croft held a lamp above them and could not read what they said. The continent has a habit of opening briefly, showing what it holds, and then closing again. The quarry in Moniteau County was open for 48 hours in 1927. The stone circle on the floor of Grand Traverse Bay was open long enough for a man with a sonar to mark the coordinates. The Kansas field was open for the length of time a farmer needed to climb down and climb back up again. These are not accidents of geology. They are the rate at which the land returns what was put into it, which is slower than a human lifetime and faster than the institutions designed to investigate such things are built to move. The ground does not wait for a funded survey, it opens on its own schedule. The question that every one of these accounts forces is not whether the evidence is real. The question is whether the system designed to examine evidence is capable of moving in the same window the land makes available. In Moniteau County, that window was May of 1927. It closed in 48 hours. The next time it opens, if it opens, will not announce itself in advance. It will drain the water out of some ordinary-looking feature of the land on some ordinary morning, and whoever is standing at the edge will have to decide in the next few hours what to do with what they are looking at. Elias Croft made his decision. He went down, he saw what he saw, he came back up, and he kept it. He held it for 34 years, and then gave it to one person, who gave it to one historian, who filed it in one archive, where it has sat for 35 years more, and the quarry is still there, and the water is still cold, and the chamber floor, in all likelihood, is still exactly as it was on the morning the flood made it visible. The Missouri limestone does not give up what it holds without a reason. The flood was the reason, once. The archive is the reason, still. And the ground underneath that pasture is the reason neither of those facts has been enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.